Hey grownups! This is a video to give you some ideas for how to support your child with writing. Your kiddo is going to be doing a lot of writing this year in response to our online lessons, and they're going to need some help sometimes. And so this video is to give you some guidance on how to help them. The main thing we find ourselves stuck with in writing is kids asking for help with spelling, and us wanting them to have good spelling. You know, we want to teach kids to spell. And we want them to do a good job, but we also don't want them leaning on us for every word, right? We don't want them saying, how do you spell my? How do you spell dog? How do you spell is? How do you spell nice? We don't want them asking that all the time. We want them trying to spell. We want them using a combination of the words they know, like the words they've already learned, and the sounds they know to try to figure words out, because it's really good phonics practice to be trying to spell. So one of the good rules of thumb with spelling is to, most of the time, try to tell them something that they could tell themselves if they were by themselves. Some examples of that would be sound it out. Try to sound out the word. This is especially helpful trying to spell a word like, mom, where the sounds are so clear. They're right there. It is okay to tell kids to sound out words that are really long and tricky and they're not going to get, like fantastic. They want to say, it was fantastic. It's okay to say, try sounding that out. One thing that helps too is to break it down for them. Break it into syllables. Say, well, fantastic. Spell each of those. Try to spell fan, then spell tas, then spell tick. And it's even helpful to break down the parts. So like something I'll do in the classroom with kids is I'll say, okay, well, the first part is fan, so f, at, and three sounds. And then I let them try to figure out what the three sounds are, f, at, and then I, sort of take them through the word that way. And by doing it that way, you're giving them something they could say in their own head. They could say, oh, I could break it down into its parts. They could do that on their own once they get used to the idea. They could sound it out to themselves and do that on their own. We're giving them advice that they can give themselves in their own brain. One thing you have to keep in mind when you're encouraging kids to sound out is they're going to do what's called invented spelling. They're going to get some things wrong. And like in fantastic, they might spell it like this. You can see they're missing some of the letters. They used a K for the C. That is okay sometimes. Okay? We don't really want kids doing invented spelling for we, because it's such a small, easy word to learn, and it's totally a first grade word we want kids to learn. So if a kid in my class says, how do you spell we? A short two-letter word that I want them to memorize, I'll just tell them. I'll say W-E, because it doesn't take a lot of my time and it's easy for them to learn. If I tell them fantastic, F-A-N-T-A-S-T-I-C, they're just going to have to ask me that over and over again, right then and every time they want to use it. And I'll just be really honest with them about that. I'll say, that's a long word. Try to sound it out as best you can. And if you miss some letters, it's okay. We can fix it later. Yeah, so some invented spelling is okay, especially since we want them trying long words. We don't want kids to get stuck writing like, I like my mom, I like my dad, I like my dog, I like my cat, I like my hat, because those are the words they know how to spell, so they're just going to write the same thing over and over and over again, because it's safe. We want to encourage them to try to spell and not worry if they get every single sound. The one time in my class that I do want spelling to be perfect is if we're making something that's going to be published, something for show, something we're going to hang on the wall, something we're going to send to somebody, something that's a big production. So, when the kids are writing in their journals for me, if they have some invented spelling, I don't worry about that. If the kids are just writing how they did a math problem, that's not a spelling lesson. I don't worry about that. But if we're making a book that we're going to print on the computer and put on the shelf, then I encourage them to get the spelling right, and any words they miss, I sit down with them and say, here's how you really spell that, and just show them, right? But for most of the writing we do in the classroom, I'm encouraging independence. So when they're writing the short, easy words, I just tell them really quick. When they're writing a longer word, I'll break it down for them. I'll encourage them to sound it out, but I won't tell them those. One thing to resist, I think, is the urge to have your kid tell you what they want to write, and then you write it down for them and have them copy it. They're not really learning the words when they're just copying. It's more like drawing. They just look at what you did and just write the letters without really thinking, oh, that's the word we, that's the word the. And the other challenge is that sometimes you sit down with your kid and you say, well, what do you want to say? Tell me. And they go on and on and on. They write something that a kid wouldn't write independently because it'd be too much work. Let's say the challenge was to write a story about what happened to Goldilocks after the three bears. If a first grader does that by themselves, they might write something like, after she saw the three bears, Goldilocks went home. She told her mom she was really scared, and her mom made her soup. Okay, and that would take a first grader half an hour to write, sounding things out, thinking about it, asking some questions, some coaching from me. But if I sit down with a kid with a piece of paper and say, okay, after Goldilocks was with the bears, what did she do? They might say something like, oh, well, after Goldilocks was with the bears, she jumped out of the house and she jumped off the roof and she ran through the forest and she ran and she ran and she ran and she got to a lake and she jumped in the boat. And suddenly I'm scripting 20 minutes of writing that they're then just going to copy for ages, and it's not very good practice. So I do not encourage just like writing down what you want, what the kid wants to say and having them copy it. I do encourage telling them the spelling of the really short words so that they can try to learn that and start storing those in their head, and encourage them to sound out spelling for the really long words. One last thing I want to talk about here is just kind of give you a glimpse of the stages that kids go through when they're learning how to spell and write. The first thing kids do when they're really little, when they're first learning about writing, is they just make marks on the paper that are sort of writing like. You know, they'll draw a picture that looks like this, a bunch of scribbles, and the writing will look like this. And you can tell which part is the writing, but they're not using any real letters. It's just scribbles that look like drawing and scribbles that look like writing. The next stage that kids get into is actually using letters. They learn, oh yeah, these letters are writing. But they don't necessarily sound anything out with them. Keep in mind, this is what kids do on their own. Like, if they're being very tightly coached by a parent, you might not notice the stage they're really in. Like, if they're always asking, how do you spell this? How do you spell that? And you're always answering, you might not know that they're actually in this letter stage where they don't know any sounds yet because they're just leaning on you so much. So that another reason to encourage independence is so we figure out where they really are as writers. So yeah, the stage after just a scribbly stage is using letters, but not necessarily connected to sounds. They just write a bunch of letters, and then, you know, they might write something like this and say, this says I love you, mommy. And, you know, none of those letters correspond with the sounds. Often they use a lot of the letters in their name. Then the next stage is starting to understand, oh, letters make sounds. I'm supposed to use letters and sounds. And that's kind of that invented spelling stage I was talking about, where I love you, mommy might look like this. And so they're missing some letters. They're not hearing some of the trickier sounds, but they're getting there. They're starting to build up to it. And then the stage after that is starting to learn that there's some interesting little rules in writing. Like, there's some words that you just learn how to spell that don't go with the sounds, or that there's some unexpected sounds like ing that you just kind of learn as a chunk. And that's where we're really getting into the sophisticated, like, real writing and spelling. And so when you know what stage your child is in, or when you've made a guess what stage your child is in, your goal is sort of to move them to the next stage, right? If your child is writing scribbles for their writing, they're not ready to talk about how to spell things right. They need you saying, hey, use real letters in your writing. You know, get an alphabet out there for them to look at. You can encourage them to be sounding out, but they just need to start using letters. If they're in the stage where they're just using letters, but the letters don't go with sounds, then your coaching starts to be, hey, what sounds do you hear when you're spelling that? To get them used to this idea that, oh, I should be using sounds. But if they're already writing, if they're sounding out a lot of words and you can look at it and you can kind of read it, but they're not using very many correct spellings, now you're ready to say, oh, by the way, we is spelled like this and the is spelled like this, to tell them the spellings, because they're ready for that. All right, I hope this is helpful to you. and gives you some ideas for how to work with your kiddo and help them with writing.